A very warm welcome to you all here and those who are watching on Zoom, despite this chilly evening. Thank you all for coming. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Steffan Davies from Bristol University. And his topic this evening is Collections in Exile, from Die Sammlung to the frame narrative novel, which he will explain himself.
Well, thank you. I have about 50 minutes to explain it, I hope.
Questions afterwards. I must let you know, and those online, that this is being recorded. So if you don't wish to appear, when you ask a question especially, please either turn away or for people online, just close your ears. Otherwise, we'd be very pleased to see your faces.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Jana and members of the Centre, and thank you, Gordana, for the invitation to London and into the ether of Zoom to give this talk. It's great to see many of you here in London, and lovely to see many of you on Zoom too. And I'm going to talk and trust that those of you on Zoom can hear, and that if you can't, someone sooner or later will find a way of telling us that you're in the dark. Okay. Well, two kinds of collection preoccupied many of the exiles from National Socialism in the 1930s. Many first had left books and manuscripts behind, as well as other valuable artifacts. These collections were often lost in exile or notoriously sold off at artificially low prices. And many of those that were preserved were inaccessible and their future uncertain. Efforts to secure or replace them and indignation at their loss recur in exile biographies. And the tracing of lost collections has since become a matter not only of academic research, but of curatorial practice, of libraries and museums' duty to restitute items acquired wrongfully after 1933. Second, however, mirroring the loss of physical collections, exiles gathered, voicing their opposition to the regime they had fled in newspapers and journals, clubs and associations, and in surveys and anthologies of their writing. On the 10th of May 1934, the first anniversary of the book burnings, the Deutsche Bibliothek opened in Paris, with the intention of inverting the destruction of books in Germany by collecting a copy of each banned work. And similar initiatives were tried elsewhere, including here in London. In this talk, I want to explore the connection between material collections and other forms of gathering together in exile. Although I've started with the Bibliothek, I want to focus less on institutions, vital as they were, and more on how this connection was made in written texts. So I'll start, and here's a roadmap for you. I'll start on probably familiar ground for many of you with the book bans and burnings, and with letting in a few more Zoomers. I'll start with the book bans and burnings in 1933, which paradoxically came to define Immigrantenliteratur, and initiatives to gather exile authors, most prominently Klaus Mann's journal Die Sammlung. I then want to look briefly at two parallel works of Walter Benjamin, in which the material and the conceptual importance of collecting and collections come together, Deutsche Menschen and the essay Ich packe meine Bibliothek aus. For the rest of my talk, I want to introduce literary texts in which collecting of different kinds is decisive. There are many of those. Libraries and their destruction are in the foreground in, say, Elias Canetti's Die Blendung and Leon Feuchtwanger's Die Geschwister Oppermann. But I want to concentrate on three: Walter Mehrings Die verlorene Bibliothek, Veza Canetti's Die Schildkröten, and Alfred Döblin's Hamlet. And I want to suggest by the end that the collected frame narrative structure of Döblin's Hamlet was particularly germane to exile writing. And I also want to observe in all three texts how the act of collecting, perhaps unexpectedly, has a destabilizing effect on the work of memory. So let's start with number one. The attachment to books spans time, and it spans a range of reasons for owning them. A working library, financial value, aesthetic enjoyment of fine artifacts, the pleasure of collecting, emotional attachment. Books are the resources and the products of the literary author, and they are metonyms for their contents. The book itself stands for prized values or seditious ideas. So the hard fact of books censored or destroyed, or that are the cause of their author's persecution, has always met and mirrored the literary imagining of dangerous books and their power. There's a wealth of writing about this, of course, and over at the Warburg Institute, there's now the centerpiece of Edmund de Waal's installation Library of Exile, which intended to make that knowledge, the book knowledge, visual and experiential. Under Nazism, however, culture was a chosen battleground of the regime. And for all that Germany's authorities had banned books as they were published in the past, and for all that exiles had fled with little or no baggage, at no point had the state prohibited such a long list of authors, achieved such a comprehensive ban on their writings, or condoned the looting of the personal libraries they'd left behind. Steffan Davies recalled that even in February 1933, the book burnings 3 months later had seemed unthinkable. The book burnings were intended, of course, to be symbolic, and they confirmed the decision of many authors to leave Germany. Paradoxically, the lists of authors who were banned and expatriated from 1933 onwards became a working definition of exile literature. The collection Verboten und Verbrannt in 1947, here on the slide, indicated this in its preface. And when by 1938 it was clear that exile literature was too diverse to be easily defined, Döblin proposed that emigrant should simply mean, quotes, banned in the Third Reich. Inclusion on the lists was also a badge of pride. Many exiles said this in different ways, but none more memorably than Oskar Maria Graf's protest at being included on a list of approved reading, Verbrennt mich. This was also a matter of real danger and real loss. Graf's spirited phrase may, of course, raise a smile, but less so his account in the same article of his flat being ransacked. Während meiner zufälligen Abwesenheit aus München erschien die Polizei in meiner dortigen Wohnung, mich zu verhaften. Sie beschlagnahmte einen großen Teil unwiederbringlicher Manuskripte, mühsam zusammengetragenes Quellenstudienmaterial, meine sämtlichen Geschäftspapiere und einen großen Teil meiner Bücher. There are many other similar accounts. As Graf points out, these were not just symbolic objects. They were valuable, irreplaceable work and tools of the trade. It's the same reality which saw books and manuscripts moved out of Germany. Very locally to here, one thinks again of A.B. Warburg's library and of the manuscripts of Steffan Davies donated to the British Library, to name just two very prominent collections. Shifting the focus, the material collections endangered or destroyed in Nazi Germany were mirrored in exile by the urge to gather and to collect. There were a range of motives for this: human and practical need, political opposition, the need for a literary profile and presence. Exile writing gathered and was defined in journals and anthologies and in critical surveys. The most obvious of these journals, just by its title, was Klaus Mann's Die Sammlung, which declared an aim to serve literature by resisting fascism. Sammeln wollen wir, was den Willen zur menschenwürdigen Zukunft hat, statt den Willen zur Katastrophe, den Willen zum Geist statt dem Willen zur Barbarei, den Willen zum hohen, leichten und verpflichtenden Spiel des Gedankens, zu seiner Arbeit, zu seinem Dienst, statt zum Schritt des Parademarsches, den Willen zur Vernunft, statt dem zur hysterischen Brutalität. There's perhaps a hint of another meaning of sammeln, sich sammeln, to collect oneself, to gather inner strength, when Mann writes in the same preface that, quotes, für dieses verstoßene, für dieses zum Schweigen gebrachte Deutschland wollen wir eine Stätte der Sammlung sein, nach unseren Kräften. Another form of collecting and defining was the Exile anthology. Deutsch für Deutsche is one example, a camouflage collection published in 1935 by the Schutzverband Deutscher Schriftsteller in Paris in collaboration with the Freedom Library. It purported to be one of a series of how-to guides, the Miniaturbibliothek. Here's one on the screen if anyone wants to become a furrier. And it was meant to bring the new, vivacious work of 43 exile authors to a readership inside Germany. Döblins pamphlet, Die deutsche Literatur im Ausland seit 1933, published in 1938, surveyed emigrant writing, as did Walter Behrenssohn's book, Die humanistische Front, finished in 1939, but not published until 1946, when it became an early intervention in establishing awareness of exile literature after the end of the Third Reich. I've passed quickly through these for reasons of time, but what's common to them all is that they articulated and anticipated the, quotes, my quotes, big questions around German exile literature at the time and since. What defined Immigrantenliteratur? Indeed, was there such a thing as a discrete literature of exile? Hermann Kästen provocatively argued that no, there wasn't. Exile literature was a category invented by the regime to minoritize their work, to give Kästen a term from today. And to admit someone else while we're at it. To give Kästen a term from today. Behrenssohn's study answered back against Kästen's objections and also against Döblin. Could exile literature include authors inside the Third Reich? Döblin said yes. Should it be politically engaged? Could German authors in exile be understood as a coherent group? If we go back to Die Sammlung, we see what Carina von Lindeiner has called radical openness in the diversity of the contributions it published, a range of literary styles and of political positions. Though that same openness which fostered Sammlung in the short term was also the journal's undoing over time. Die Sammlung closed at the end of its second volume in August 1935. And to go back to those questions, how could exile literature claim to represent Germany? From the start, the collectors of exile writing didn't see just its national significance, a good Germany or a true Germany, but made the claim for its importance on an international stage too. This was a consistent concern for Klaus Mann and for Behrenssohn as well. Behrenssohn feels very contemporary when he measures the standing of German language exile authors through the lens of translation and by their preeminence in the League of Nations Index of translated books. Well, one of the people in whom collecting as a concept and as reality come together is Walter Benjamin. Benjamin, for one thing, articulated the modern and modernist consciousness of living in a fragmentary world and of the collector as the figure who thus preserves dispersed objects, but preserves them as dispersed. An item in a museum, or often in an anthology, is not in the place where it was originally found. Benjamin also struggled to bring his own library to safety, first with Bertolt Brecht in Svendborg, after his own exile from Berlin to Paris. And he was the author of one of the period's most remarkable anthologies, Deutsche Menschen. This collected 26 letters of prominent Germans, ostensibly written across the century from 1783 to 1883, with the aim of showing an alternative German classical heritage without the accretions of national prestige, which the authors had acquired in retrospect. This was not an anthology, said Benjamin, because it was not meant to be edifying. It wasn't meant to be a pretty collection of flowers, an anthology, literally, but instead a call to act. And so here, his correspondence, despite the famous names, are at their most human, lonely, grieving, in exile, in straitened circumstances, burdened by love, reflecting on old age and death, where literary history prizes youth. Benjamin saw the collection as eine Art goldene Klassikerbibliothek in Nuce, which by reprinting letters practically unknown to educated Germans and, as Benjamin put it, unspoilt by them, would offer a completely new perspective on their author's thoughts. Deutsche Menschen was not, strictly speaking, an exile project. Benjamin had published the letters and his prefaces to them in series in the Frankfurter Zeitung in 1931 and 1932. After 1933, he proposed various ways to extend or renew the project before it was republished as the book which many of us know. In letters in 1931 and 1932 to Gershom Scholem, however, Benjamin had already foreseen the catastrophe to come. Deutsche Menschen was one of the books which, quotes, show the site of the catastrophe for which I can see no bounds in the coming years of my life. At the same time, in his 1931 essay, Ich packe meine Bibliothek aus, he addressed the notion of collecting more lightheartedly. And I do think it's interesting to think of these two alongside each other, not to think the gap on to 1936 immediately. Here he's more lighthearted. Here again, in the essay on the library, he wants to remove the books, texts, and authors from the prestige they had acquired in bourgeois German culture. Benjamin describes taking his books out of their packing cases in a new flat. And these are, of course, the same books which would be on the move again only a few years later. As he unpacks, his library is at a point where it's not yet back on the shelves and hasn't yet returned to what he calls the quiet boredom of order. In this state, the books have meaning by chance association rather than by logic, and their disorder is transformative, opening out an endless range of possible significance. They remind their collectors of the cities across Europe where they were bought. And he muses that although most antiquarian books are bought by plan, from a catalogue, even then the process is attended by moments of chance and surprise. Thus, order in the collection constantly, quotes, hangs over the abyss, and the collector lives in a dialectic of order and chaos. Benjamin's modern collector ostensibly, and of course Benjamin is, if we see the eye of the essay as Benjamin, he's not entirely telling the truth, of course, but Benjamin's modern collector ostensibly doesn't own books for the positive, useful purposes of previous eras, to gather resources, to discover new worlds, preserve knowledge. Instead, the purpose and order of the collection is vested solely in himself, for whom each book encyclopedically reveals its history as an object rather than as a text. So with that range of collections and collectors in mind, let's now slow down a bit, and turn to those three literary texts, to Mehring, to Canetti, and to Döblin. Walter Mehring, a leading figure in the political cabaret of the Weimar Republic, fled Berlin in 1933. He moved to Paris, then to Austria, and back to France in 1938, where he was twice interned before being helped to emigrate to the USA in 1941. He returned to West Germany in 1953 and died in Zurich in 1981. First published in English translation in 1951, Die verlorene Bibliothek, Autobiographie einer Kultur, has autobiographical resonances for Mehring too. To date, the library of his father, Sigmar Mehring, has not been found. And it hints at the practicalities of a library's rescue from Nazism, how this happened, how it came about, including the help of the Czechoslovak diplomat, translator and poet Kamil Hoffmann, who was murdered in Auschwitz. Mehring's narrator first goes back in memory to the core of his father's library, the cultural inheritance of the 19th century, and specifically the European realist novel as it developed in France and Russia. For the father, the library had represented reason against the irrational, order against disorder, a bulwark to prevent humanity from relapsing into barbarism. As a convinced atheist, he classified its many copies of the scriptures alongside encyclopedias, sociology, and ethnography. Little could father or son know how the narrator's schoolfellows, classically educated like the narrator himself, would become, quote, Praetorians, witch hunters, and crazed murderers, or indeed pogrom victims, when the bulwark collapsed. Secondly, the father sees the 19th century corpus as a golden age of European culture, the point at which the West, quotes, had discovered itself. The library is meant to be the narrator's material and cultural inheritance from a father who himself resisted the power of the state. The father was arrested in his library for lèse-majesté and died there during the First World War, leaving it in perfect order. But the narrator only enters into that inheritance as he reassembles the library in exile in 1930s Vienna, replacing its order from optical memory of the book's covers. It was his father who knew their contents, though he too had not read them all. The narrator paradoxically wants the library and the comfort it offers when it's too late. When his flat in Vienna is ransacked and the library is finally destroyed, the narrator again remarks that he's never missed the library or read it as thoroughly as he does now, point of its destruction. In his youth, by contrast, he rebelled against the canon's values and aesthetics. The father's condemnation of avant-garde art was, of course, the perfect attraction to it for the son. In addition, the narrator's early adulthood was interrupted by the First World War, which shattered the father's belief in progress, but not in culture. The son, on the other hand, fought in the First World War. Becoming a soldier moves the narrator further still from the library into what he calls, at that point, World War I, what he calls a voluntary homelessness. The war, quotes, turned all the schools and libraries into field hospitals and academies for the science of murder. And with teachers changed into sergeant majors, the narrator placed all his hope on the downfall of tradition. He only comes home, in inverted commas, to quote the novel, only comes home from this homelessness when he later rebuilds the library in exile in Vienna. When the narrator returns to the scene of his father's death in the library in World War I and says, quotes, that this was, quotes, the room where an epoch died, it's easy to read the text as a nostalgic lament for a better past and a confession of the narrator's folly and that of the age from the grim retrospect of the 1940s. But the library and its contents are more complicated. For one thing, it's not, in fact, the fixed bastion of Enlightenment values that it first seems to be. It contains a great range of literature, not least for the narrator in adolescence, a sizable dose of erotic writing ranging from parts of the Bible to the Marquis de Sade. The text references to Jonathan Swift's The Battle of the Books, 1704, in which the ancient and modern books fight for superiority in St. James's Palace Library, are a humorous reminder that the library's claim to represent modern reason is itself a declaration of rebellion against the past. So some of the library's highlights themselves challenge the cliché of a sober, rational 19th century. Oscar Panizza's grotesque satire on Roman Catholicism, Liebeskonzil, for example, and the pinnacle of the collection, the poetry of Baudelaire, Rimbaud, and Verlaine. The father's amour de loin of the Paris of the Third Republic gave him a dogmatic infatuation with, quotes, the youngest of the goddesses, La Liberté. This is a light-hearted way of suggesting that the library contained the makings of its own downfall, as is the narrator's observation that his father was outraged to find traces of religiosity in iconoclastic figures like Darwin and Huysmans. The narrator sees a corrupting, occult potential in the library, which his father's generation thought they could contain, and a Faustian, hubristic faith in knowledge and progress. So the library does not work as a rational bulwark against Nazism. But the breadth of life which it in fact evokes does make it resistant to dogma. It offers a gallery of exiles in whose company the narrator stands: Ovid, Dante, Tasso, Heine, Büchner, Hugo, and Zola. The symbolist Arthur Rimbaud, whom he describes as a precursor of our exile. And it's in the library that he meets Ernst Toller, his father's last visitor there before his death. It contrasts with the institutional library, places like this, which is, quotes, the true graveyard of ideas. And it's all right, I work at university as well. And it's a refuge from the narrator's school education too, though it also contrasts with coffee houses, the sites of the potential which resides in unwritten books, sort of sits in between them. The narrator's claim that the sole purpose of literature is for the reader to fall in love with it leads him to observe how haphazardly the canon has been formed. Generationen hatten kein Ohr für Johann Sebastian Bachs Matthäus-Passion, bis der junge getaufte Jude Mendelssohn Bartholdy sie erhörte, he writes. In these respects, despite the vast differences in tone and focus, Mehring's book also recalls the emphasis on undogmatic association in Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, another collection whose texts also extend beyond the high canon and were chosen, Auerbach said, quotes, on the basis of accidental acquaintance and personal preference, rather than in view of a definite purpose. Undogmatic association also makes Die verlorene Bibliothek a work about memory rather than simply literary history. The text reflects at various points on memory, including a section on the Madeleine episode of Proust's Du Côté de chez Swann, which throws the reader off the scent, because so much of the remembering in Mehring is in fact not involuntary, as in Proust, but deliberate. The narrator restores the library from memory, but insubstantially. Manuela Günther has shown that the father's collecting of books becomes the son's collecting of quotations, and that those quotations have a, quote, restless and fleeting effect. Where the narrator does describe his reading habits, they've been very different from his father's, books left behind on trains and in hotels in his voluntary homelessness in the 1920s. Quotation and the proliferation of authors and titles in the text do not restore meaning, but dislocate it. Recalling the library as a constellation of names and texts means that it looks ordered, but its original meaning can't be restored. And when it's finally back on the shelves in Vienna, it seems, in the light of an electric lamp in the room, to cast occult necromantic shadows that make it, quotes, anheimelnd und unheimlich zugleich. Even the library's original order, as the father created it, is introduced in the disordered context of the First World War. Wolfgang Adam sees the narrator's reconstruction of the library as similar to the episode taught as a method in ancient mnemotechnics, the dinner party attended by Simonides of Chios, at which the roof collapsed, and Simonides identified the bodies of the dead by remembering who had been sitting where. Simonides' feat restores a shattered unity insofar as it re-establishes the identities of the disfigured victims, just as Mehring's narrator pieces together the book's significance as he restores them to the shelves. But of course, Simonides doesn't bring the dinner guests back to life. Memory and quotation are thus both the products of loss. The catastrophe at the dinner party, the missing context from which the quotations come. Neither is possible without loss, and neither can fully make up for the loss it signals. Mehring echoes and prefigures theorists of memory who distinguish the preserved knowledge of the bookshelf from memory in active use. One of the text's repeated intertexts is exiled Lot, instructed to turn his back on Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot becomes a model for the narrator's departure from Vienna, leaving the books behind. Like the wicked cities, the library and the culture it represents are remembered here for the fact of their irretrievable loss, and the narrator's method of remembering them simultaneously enshrines them and breaks away from their remains. At the same time, this memory of loss is fundamentally different from the erasure of culture at which Nazism aimed. The lost library, then, is not a defined resource which can correct, inform, and inspire, as the Father's once was. The narrator's remembered library is instead a document of constant loss and constant change. Let's move on. The fall of Vienna in the Anschluss, which is the inevitable future at the start of Die verlorene Bibliothek, is also the setting of Veza Canetti's Die Schildkröten. Written here in London in 1939, in the early months of Veza and Elias Canetti's exile from Nazi Austria, the novel was only published in 1999, more than 3 decades after Veza Canetti's death in London in 1963. The novel tells the story of Jewish citizens of Vienna as Nazism takes over the city. At their center, the married couple Eva and Andreas Kain, and Andreas's brother Werner. Andreas is a writer and intellectual. There are striking similarities between the Kains and the Canettis, and Werner is a geologist. Werner is dismissed from the research institute where he works, and Andreas and Eva's flat is expropriated to accommodate an SA officer with the sort of talking name Pilz. Emigration is the only place of safety for the 3 Kains, but Werner, the only one of the 3 who has a British visa, refuses to go. He's arrested when the police confuse him with his brother, and he dies in Buchenwald. Eva and Andreas finally receive visas for Britain and escape. The story includes 3 significant collections: Andreas's library, displaced by Pilz's encroachment on the flat, Werner's collection of stones at his home and at the Geological Institute, and the collection of photographs of film scenes which belongs to another of the Jewish characters, Herr Felberbaum, and those are the only remaining witnesses to Felberbaum's past life running a cinema. These collections are not at the center of the plot, but they and others draw out its key themes: order and disorder, the pressing need to flee from Vienna, and the fear and anger which attend the unraveling of an ordered world. Unable or unwilling to speak directly about the reality they face, the characters tell each other stories to illuminate their situation and defy it. In turn, this storytelling itself becomes a form of collecting and a provisional replacement for the objects which the characters have lost. Andreas Kain is introduced as der Lesende in seinem Bibliothekszimmer. The peace and order of his library is over, however, before the novel's reader even sees it, as Eva has rushed into the room, shocked by the Nazi flag she has seen hanging from a nearby block, and tells him that, like the biblical Cain, he must leave the land. As Kain's library is boxed up, its destination unknown, it crosses over with the crates of ammunition being delivered to the house for Pilz. And if Kain echoes not only Cain, but also Elias Canetti's Peter Keen, as Julian Priest has argued, then the combination of books and explosives in the hallway evokes a very similar end, though that end doesn't come. Exile is particularly difficult for a poet who's separated from the language which animates his actions. But Andreas can in fact leave Austria more easily than Werner, who is mit allen Fasern an dieser Erde hier gebunden. Werner donates his geological collection to the Natural History Museum for safekeeping, and the instructions he gives the museum official show very clearly that the collection's value is not just the stones themselves, which of course are much harder to destroy than the books, but their order. Each is to be wrapped in cotton wool and placed mit Berücksichtigung der Nummer und des Faches seiner Herkunft as it's transported away. And for this reason, the way in which the brown shirts take over the Institute's collection and throw it onto a rubbish dump is a calamity. As with Andreas's books, the reader never finds out whether Werner's stones reach the museum safely. The collections thus become symbols of order and disorder in a world that's out of joint, its values turned upside down. Nazism claims to be installing a new order, but that order is itself disordered, it's cruel, but also haphazard and illogical. The stereotype appearances which supposedly reinforce the Nazis' definition of a Jew are confounded by characters whose looks are different. Hilda, for example, the Jewish girl who's tall and blonde. The destruction of material collections in the novel, then, contrasts with collecting in alternative human forms. First of all, one response to the disorder is sich, sammeln, in that sense of composing oneself. Eva finds this composure after her shock at the novel's start when she sees Andreas smiling at her. And she later envisages that in exile in England, they will similarly gather themselves. The characters also gather physically at two meals, one in each of the novel's two parts. Eva, Hilda, and Andreas's dinner party in chapter 4, Das Gastmahl, at which Pilz is supposedly the guest of honor, is meant to restore the upset order by humiliating Pilz, if only for one night. Pilz is served a revolting tinned turtle soup, and he's subject to a spirited conversation which he struggles to match with jokes and political barbs at his expense. Hilda flirts with him and gets him drunk, and his wife, who arrives unexpectedly from Germany, finds him dishevelled in his uniform the following morning. The party reverses Plato's Symposium, a dinner party discussion of human love and goodness, in its own attempt to reverse the status quo, though its hosts know from the start that it will only fictitiously restore the order that they've lost. Hier herrscht Bon Ton, also Artigkeit, also eigentlich die Lüge, Andreas tells Pilz as he introduces the evening. For the second meal in chapter 8, Das Versöhnungsfest, Andreas, Eva, Werner, and Felberbaum are gathered in Werner's flat on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, a day of introspection, and the festival at which the human fates written into the Book of Life 10 days previously at New Year are sealed. Werner objects that it's naive to celebrate a festival when outside the SA are terrorizing Jews on the streets. And at the end of the chapter, the characters' fates are sealed in secular reality, as an official comes to the door to tell them that they must leave Austria, no matter what permissions they have or don't have to travel, or else they will be shot. Like the dinner which Simonides attended and remembered, these two dinner parties are thus also underlain by the fact of their imminent destruction. After Eva's called out of the room on Yom Kippur to answer the doorbell, which she has feared all along, she returns to a party which as yet is physically unchanged, but metaphorically is in ruins. When Werner's objection to the Yom Kippur meal nearly brings the party to a stop, Felberbaum saves the conversation by telling the story of his lucky escape in Cairo from the accusation that he'd stolen a mummy from the museum. It turns out that the souvenir he thought he'd bought as a bargain was a fake. So we're back with appearances and reality again. The mummy is a fake, made out of material made by the very company that Färberbaum was in Cairo to represent as a travelling salesman. Andreas suggests that to maintain the festive mood at the dinner, everyone should tell a story in turn, and he follows Färberbaum with the tale of a poet who's arrested, leaves incriminating papers on his desk, and then pulls off a plan to have those papers smuggled into his jail, where his jailer burns them. This pattern, which also fits the Jewish culture of storytelling, runs through the novel. Stories which the characters tell throughout to cheer each other up and to hold out hope, to assert themselves against the new regime, and arguably to deny reality. Thus, the novel as a whole treads a balance between artful storytelling and unavoidable fact. These levels may seem to talk past each other. There's no miraculous intervention for Eva when the city official rings at the door. And Färberbaum's cheerful stories jar with the real story later on, in the present day, of his imprisonment, release, further mistreatment, and hospitalization, as well as with his uncertain fate. We don't know what happens to him at the end of the novel. At the same time, the storytelling is rooted in reality. This seems to me to fit the praise that some critics have given Die Schildkröten, that it's an alternative to the analysis of contemporary circumstances in other exile novels, which aim to expose the causes of Nazism rationally and examine its effects. The motifs in Die Schildkröten are bewildering if each reference is traced in full, as the parallels don't fully match. Andreas, for example, most certainly does survive by means of Werner's death, but he certainly is not the fratricidal Cain of the Bible. Rather, as Alexander Koshenina observes, the motifs, quote, merge into an aesthetic structure which has more general validity than is suggested by the novel's historical facts. As a result, the storytelling in Die Schildkröten, like the dense quotation in Die verlorene Bibliothek, shows the instability of memory in exile, as well as its importance. The novel remembers Vienna at the Anschluss in recognizable events and episodes. It was one of the first literary depictions of the November pogrom of 1938. Yet its memory is also indistinct. Specific places in the city are hardly ever mentioned, and Vienna is never named. And some of the episodes, including the symposium meal, are far-fetched. As Priest points out, it's a novel about leave-taking. It remembers Vienna at the Anschluss, but it charts how the material media of memory are lost, and the spaces and places which might be remembered are erased. The tortoises of the title, sold as, quote, souvenirs of the happiest city in Central Europe, are nothing of the sort, as they have swastikas branded in their shells. The characters' stories do not draw on the shared recollection which is at the center of collective memories, or generate a shared meaning. Instead, as the characters' lives are upturned, they are stories told in the absence of reliable, usable memory about other places and people. Instead of memory, which is connective, the novel's reality is distance, ejection from home, exile from Austria, and so is its technique, as the ironic unrealities of the dinner party and the miraculous stories become a means of survival. Canetti, like her protagonist Andreas, tells stories to defy reality and to grasp it at the same time. In 1975, Wolf Segebrecht observed that social storytelling in fiction does not take place for its own sake, but always in defense against a threat of some kind or other. Characters come together in adversity and tell stories to stave off the moment when the threat becomes real. Famously, Scheherazade tells the stories in the Arabian Nights, accompanied by her sister Dinazad, to delay her execution and end the killing of the girls in King Shahryar's kingdom. In Boccaccio's Decameron, less is at stake, but the storytellers have fled the plague in Florence and are passing the time until they can return. Segebrecht argued that intradiegetic storytelling tends to be affirmative and stabilizing, whether by asserting an endangered status quo or by proposing a new order. And he read Goethe's Unterhaltung deutscher Ausgewanderten, with its correction of one of the émigrés' Jacobinism as an example of the former, and the dialogues in Brecht's Flüchtlingsgespräche with their anticipation of a socialist future as the latter. So collected stories within a story are attempts to stabilize, even where they're transparently futile, and they place the motives and reliability of their tellers in the foreground. The attention which the genre gives to authenticity and artifice has the potential to reopen the exile's acute question about the purpose of artistic creation. The entertaining stories in the Decameron seem frivolous when Scheherazad's are a matter of life and death. Furthermore, frame narrative reflects the realities of publication in exile and writing for the draw, the lack of access to readers which some of the exile anthologies sought to remedy. Hermann Broch's Die Schuldlosen, published in 1950, retrospectively traces the ethical guilt of criminally innocent Germans before 1933, unpolitical petty bourgeois people whose indifferent mindset, Broch wrote, was the source from which Nazism gathered strength. Broch's novel assembled stories which he had written by 1934, but failed to publish before his emigration from Austria in 1938, and their adaptation to the theme of German guilt radically altered their original conception when they were eventually published. Another example is Leo Perutz's novel collection, frame novel, Nachts unter der Steinenbrücke, finished in 1951. I think of another of these exile frame novels. But to come to my last example, Döblin's novel Hamlet oder Die lange Nacht nimmt ein Ende, concerned like Broch's Schuldlosen with responsibility for the war, also integrated stories which he later suggested had been, quote, sketched like in the Arabian Nights before the novel's conception. On its title page, he recorded that he'd begun it in 1945 in exile in Hollywood and finished it in Baden-Baden the following year. But he withheld it from publication to prioritize other works he'd written in exile, including, and perhaps most notably, November 1918. Because those sold badly, the publishers also rejected Hamlet in turn, and it was only with considerable effort that the novel finally appeared in East Berlin in 1956, less than a year before Döblin's death. Repeated motifs and thematic strands in Hamlet connect the embedded stories to the frame and the novel to its context. In those discussions of who is an exile, which I mentioned before, Döblin had been open to forms of exile which were figurative rather than physical, and that stance is reinforced here, as John White observed, quotes, by the bold metaphors of exclusion, alienation, and symbolic self-isolation in the stories and in the frame alike. On the face of it, the characters in Hamlet use storytelling to speak about unspeakable things. Edward Allison, an English soldier, is maimed and traumatized by a kamikaze attack on his troop ship in the Far East at the end of the war. He returns home with his memory impaired and asking compulsively who or what is to blame. His doctors give him a, quote, truth drug, pentotal, to try to unlock the memories he cannot articulate, but this fails. Meanwhile, his father, Gordon, a writer who is first encountered, again, in his library, cannot cope with Edward's questioning. Gordon, who fought in the First World War, has supported the Second World War from his desk, plundering the classics on his shelves for quotations to fortify the gung-ho writings of which he has now become ashamed. He has failed to ask the questions of the First World War, which Edward is asking of the Second. He and Alice, Alice is Gordon's wife and Edward's mother, he and Alice have been disengaged innocents, like Broch's characters, in the intervening years. Gordon proposes to answer Edward's questioning with a series of storytelling evenings, whose principle is Fantasie die Wahrheit zu ermitteln. With the exception of two moving stories told by Edward's mother, Alice, about mothers searching for their missing soldier sons in Paris and in Naumburg. With those two exceptions, the stories the characters tell are indeed myths and fictions set outside the present. Edward complains that his father writes cheerful stories and, quotes, never portrays us and our society like, say, Balzac, Zola, or Galsworthy. Though his own flawed identification of himself with Shakespeare's Hamlet also follows his father's principle of fantasy in search of the truth. The stories answer Edward by revealing the elements of human behavior which lead to human conflict. So themes of the stories: desire, obsession, vengefulness, the pursuit of illusions, the uninhibited exercise of strength, especially by men against women. Believing that he has found all of these in the history of his own parents, Edward observes that he has found the root cause of war not in culture or society, but, quotes, in the comfort of one's home. The stories in Hamlet are supposed to be told in search of the truth, but many of them rest on illusion. Gordon's story about the troubadour Geoffrey Rudel, and the long story which James, his brother-in-law, who's a university librarian, back with the university libraries again, James tells a long story about King Lear in his prime, before he became, quotes, old and stupid. Both subvert the canonical stories of their tales with free inventions of their own. The Princess of Tripoli, whom Geoffrey the troubadour pursues, is ugly and overweight, and the poet's image, which has captivated Geoffrey, is the work of an advertising agency targeted at gullible troubadours like him. He sends his servant Gottfried to meet the princess in disguise instead of going himself, and both survive the adventure, Geoffrey and Gottfried, whereas the princess is burned to death like a witch. Alice's story about Theodora of Alexandria, who has an affair and is reunited with her husband, but then enters a monastery pretending to be a boy. Again, all these appearances that are not real. That story turns at crucial moments on mistaken appearances, and it fits Alice's fantasized self-image as a noble adulteress far better than the more complex but mundane realities of her life. The storytelling in Die Schildkröten is ironic because there is a discernible reality in the novel which contradicts the stories. In Hamlet, the absence of an outside reality after the opening sequence of Edward's injury and his return home means that the stories make the characters' realities instead. The main characters are prismatic, inventing and reinventing themselves in the mold of other characters from the stories and from the real life of the frame. Edward, also known as Hamlet, moves in with the parents of his dead comrade Johnny to reinvent himself as a son who has happily returned from the war, rather than the heir of a, quote, cursed tribe, in other words, his own family. The collecting of stories in Hamlet can be read like the collecting of books in Benjamin's Ich packe meine Bibliothek aus, where the meaning of the collection revolves around the mind and memory of its collector. Edward wants a straight answer to a direct question, although even his question slips away from specifics as die Schuld am Kriege, what he keeps asking for. Die Schuld am Kriege is guilt both for the war and for war in general. What he uncovers, however, is a reality shaped by the illogical workings of memory and illusion. Like the books in Benjamin's library, the story's openness to different meanings forms identity, but it also lets their tellers avoid facing realities beyond the story's meanings for themselves. Klaus Müller-Salget observes that the long night of Döblin's title refers in Jewish liturgy to the eve of Yom Kippur. This refocuses the novel as a serious reflection on guilt and introspection. Edward undergoes a period of quotes, reflection, preparation, and purification, and enters a monastery in Belgium at the end of the novel. Now, this conclusion reflects Döblin's conversion in exile to Roman Catholicism. And in terms of the text, it's also the culmination of a motif which runs consistently throughout. By entering the monastery, Edward leaves England, renounces the world, and puts the stories behind him. He and his sister sell the house where the evening gatherings took place, and he takes none of its books away with him, only, quotes, souvenirs. Whereas Gordon, the supreme storyteller, has asserted that individuals do not control their actions and so are not responsible for them, Edward's ordering of his inner life and the ultimate loss of the stories now show a realization which has eluded him for so long, that his search for guilt is personal, not because it leads to his family, but because responsibility for human belligerence lies, in essence, with individuals in their human interactions. In other words, with him. If the storytelling began in the absence of Edward's memory, the novel's end touches on the power of forgetting. The long night ends, and a new life begins with the loss of the people and objects of his past. Edward joins a new community as the novel's old collections are lost. Well, this balance between community and collection takes us, I hope, full circle through the material I've been discussed. It's also 7 o'clock. So the end of, but let's stick with the structural one. So with the end of Döblin's novel, I have also reached the end of my paper, and thank you very much for your attention to it.
Thank you very much indeed. What could be more appropriate as a seminar paper than this venue and the Centre for Research, for Exile Research? And I was struck by the irony of how attached we can become to our own collections, some of which in my own case I have tried to part with and taken to Oxfam and then rebought. And here we are, we're still replacing and replenishing collections. And I wonder, will someone one day think, I need all these? Or will everybody be looking at books online? And yet there is still a need. And I think that without the past, where is the present or the future? We may not want to live in the past, but we want to know about it. We want to explore, we want to share, we want to write. And how many people in this room now are still writing something or about to have something published? So it's very, very pertinent. And I think of our archives in this centre as well.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Still expanding. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you again for the invitation.
It's a pleasure. May I now open the floor to questions or observations, please, including to our viewers online?
I think there were some comments online, weren't there?
There was one from Tony.
Yeah.
Yes.
Chat.
Let's see if we can, shall we? Okay, so I'll read out Tony's comment because I'm not quite sure how we go, unless someone knows how we get it on here. Libraries could also function as a means of transcending exile and asserting a degree of integration in a new homeland. The donation of Dr. Ludwig Kantorovic's 6,000 volumes to King's College in 1946 or the acquisition of Paul Hirsch's priceless music library by the British Museum in 1946 at a knockdown price, for example, both gestures of gratitude to Britain. Anyone familiar with the collections of classics that graced the bookshelves of refugee homes will recognize how books helped transfer German language culture to Britain. And absolutely. My understanding is that the donation of the side collection to the British Library also carries with it that sense of, whether gratitude is exactly the word in that context, but continuity and
I think that's
okay. A question in the chat, but I don't want to stop.
I have a question, but I can
go ahead.
now or later. Thank you, Steffan. I have so many thoughts in my head now. I will just get rid of one thing that I thought. It has to do with the notion semiotics. So, would it be possible to formulate your argument on a semiotic level or in the language of semiotics? So, because all these questions about the relation between sign and thing, could this be a problematic within exile literature? Also, to come back to your initial question, is there something like Immigrantenliteratur, exile literature? Is semiotic problematic? And I'm thinking, I don't know if you know it, of a very good essay by, I will give you the name later, on Anna Segers, Exile als Zeichenpraxis. Like he's saying, maybe exile implies a certain way to work with signs, to establish fragmentary signs that are not completed and don't refer to reality in an ambiguous way, but are like connected to a constant deferral or postponement of meaning. Like this sounds very post-structuralist, but this is like an idea that is put forward by this exile researcher. Okay, semiotics. But I want to say one thing more concrete about this link between collection and community. Die Sammlung is part of a project to form an anti-fascist front against the Nazis. On the one hand, a project to find something like a true German identity outside Germany, but also politically an anti-fascist movement. And I think this has been a project that was not ultimately successful. I mean, not just regarding the beginning of the war, but also like, how do I form this community? That's my question. How do I form this community? And the question of this anti-fascist German community in Paris could have something to do with the politics of collection, because the further left on the left and the further left leaning and the closer I am to socialism, the less I think it's a good idea to keep the European cultural memory as it was, right? This is not very precise the way I put it, but maybe you can reflect.
Yes,
say something about it.
Well, thanks to very much for both comments, and help in the chat. The articles by Bernhard Greiner. That's not my memory. That's Dr. Bischoff's. Semiotics, yes, it works. What I wanted to get across, and of course one can sort of step in through through semiotics and be more heavily theoretical and productively so. I think, and so absolutely. What I find interesting at the same time is also this constant connection, that at the same time as writing about, at the same time as the production of literary texts which show the limitations or the sort of breakdown of the collection, and the we thought it stood for this, but actually it doesn't, and it never did, and all of that. That nonetheless, this is not just symbols, and this is also, it comes out of real experience at the same time as being a questioning of, and so on. So that was these are different ways into the same question for sure. I must go to the article too. So thanks for that. Die Sammlung and the left and heritage. How long have we got? There are those in the room and online who know much more about Die Sammlung than I do. A number of the institutions I touched on are precisely the sort of socialist, anti-Nazi, anti-fascist movement and resistance in Paris. So the Bibliothek and the Schutzverband are tight. They're one and the same thing. And again, to try and keep vaguely to time, what I didn't say is, and the other thing, the Bibliothek was there for. It wasn't just meant to be symbolic and defiant. It was meant as a tool. These were meant to be books, meant to be read, and they were meant to be used. Absolutely. So Die Sammlung certainly is in that orbit. My understanding, though, is that Mann is also trying to reach beyond that circle. He has a vision, at least, which is of political breadth, which he doesn't manage to sustain, and there are famous and less famous ways in which that kind of breaks down. On heritage, I think it depends which heritage, doesn't it? I think what is very noticeable is that there's a sort of the left socialist heritage, which many of whom the exiles in Paris. There is, for example, a French tradition and past and cultural heritage, which is very much being valorized, and Heinrich Mann and French realism and so on. At some point, I mentioned in passing, I think it's with Mehring, so Mehring's father, and the realism of France and Russia, and of course, as is well known, absolutely not the realism, the poetic realism of Germany. So there's complexity there, and there are big questions, of course, about the question: what happens now to German heritage? Are we the good continuation? So Tony's comment, the many volumes of the German classics that come in exile to sit on bookshelves, around the exile countries. And yet, also, of course, the culture that has produced what we're fleeing, and so on. There is
I'm very sorry. We don't have anything here to read.
It's great. I get to kind of I get to pick my own questions, pass over the difficult ones. No. So Carina von Lindeiner asks, Steffan, I'm wondering, what is your take on the other meaning of Sammlung, as in sich, sammeln? Do you think this is intended in the exile collections as well? So one of the experts on die Sammlung is asking the question. There is to go to the place in the paper where it most certainly comes up in that form. We're back with Die Schildkröten and the moment in early on, where Andreas smiles at Eva and sie sammelte sich, als sie sein Lächeln sah. It's quite clearly, this is a sort of she pulled herself together moment. I'm asking the question because I'm wondering, not because I have the answer. Thanks, Karina. I think it's very hard to judge, or it's very hard to generalize. Is what I mean. I think there is in many of these anthologies, say, the ambition to promote, but also to promote reflection, or to be a space that shows the product of reflection on exile. I was up the road in the British Library earlier, looking at one anthology, which I hadn't yet been able to have in my hands. And I'm going to, there's so much material that's gone that I'm going to forget its title. But it comes out in Karlsbad in Czechoslovakia in 1935. Veza der Emigration, I think it's called. It's an anthology of poetry. It's been published elsewhere. And the editor, in a very brief afterword, says, and it's pretty subjective in a way, but says, I think you will find in this collection that the best poetry was written towards the end of 1933, which does sound extremely specific. But remember, this is only being written in 35. After a few months had elapsed, and after there was time for the authors to come to terms and reflect on and so on. I forget his exact phrase. I've got it on my phone. I took a photo of it, but I won't go there now. So there is certainly that the recognition, say in a text like that, of this need for sich sammeln. There is certainly a yes, and I think it implies, this is really thinking off the cuff, but it implies a talking to each other in these publications, as well as talking outwards. We often think of, we as the readers and researchers, maybe think, well, what's the purpose of this? Yeah? Who was meant to read it? How did die Sammlung find an authorship, a readership? So how did it find an authorship? But how did it find a readership? Yeah, and perhaps this is maybe confessional because it's my own blind spot. It may be no one else's, but we mustn't forget that a substantial part of the readership are the contributors. These are also for circulation among. It is for dialogue, if you like, among exiles. And certainly, I mean, if the publications of, it comes to a point where, say, with the German League of Culture in London, fellow exiles are the audience because they're the only possible audience, and so on. The 35 volume I was looking at earlier, that's not the case. So can I leave that open? I think it's there, but I haven't, despite sort of highlighting it for the talk, I haven't gone as far into it as I could or should.
Well, we'll have the opportunity afterwards. Further. I think there's another point.
That was a yes, thank you. It's kind.
add a little comment to just
Sweet.
I think it would be interesting to connect this question of Sammlung to the move of Zerstreuung that was so prominent in all like sachlich literature, like Krakauer, Benjamin, and so many novels that deal with Zerstreuung and sich, sammeln as a counter movement.
Yes. There's a kind of in the even longer version of this, and this does, and it's as a concern, it's also present in is sort of one of the concerns, isn't it, of modernism? This sense of fragmentation, and as you say, Zerstreuung, these fragments have I shored against my ruins at the end of the wasteland, and so on. And again, I think that's absolutely, it's vital to bring in, and yet to balance with, these are real books and real lives and so on. But yes, absolutely. I mean, Kurt Pintos, the editor of the big expressionist anthology, Menschheitsdämmerung, himself ends up in exile and brings his library over to New York. So on. But yes, indeed. Yeah.
Any other observations? Please do go ahead.
Obviously, you started with sort of opening question of the age-old question of sort of what is an exile literature and how do we define it? And then you obviously opened with Benjamin, and you seem to suggest that you didn't classify Deutsche Menschen as exile literature per se. And I thought that was interesting because, well, I guess perhaps in contrast to the sort of fictional accounts that you treated, there could be a scale, right? But I did think that example is particularly interesting because many critics actually sort of have read into the fact that he chose to sort of reproduce his previously serialized those letters because they very much touched upon the experience of exile, because sort of all of these accounts of the greats and more marginal figures as well that are featured, it's often about sort of authors being in transit or being away from their loved ones. And so, obviously top sort of in terms of like, the topic or the subject, you could possibly read into that a little bit. But also this idea of collecting, specifically with the example of Benjamin, he was someone, obviously, yes, he had the library, but also he had this huge arsenal of drafts and papers. And then to go into this idea of community, that was very much how he networked, because he constantly had a million different side projects that he would be sending people, because he was hustling to try and sort of also try and make a bit of a living while he was in Paris. And Deutsche Menschen was actually one of his more lucrative endeavors because it actually sold relatively well. Yes, okay, it's 36. But I thought that was quite interesting. Maybe I misheard but yeah. And the other thing was interesting was that this idea of audience, as you mentioned, because I was also thinking about maybe this, because the title was apparently supposed to be slightly misleading to sort of fly under the radar of censorship, essentially. And so maybe it didn't necessarily, it had a mixed audience, I would say, perhaps for that reason as well.
Yes.
Because it wasn't like Die Sammlung, it didn't have sort of a manifesto on the cover or whatever. But so I don't know.
Yeah.
But maybe I misheard, but you sort of seem to indicate that within your sort of structure, you wouldn't necessarily classify this as exile writing.
I'm glad you picked up on the provocation. I mean, yes, I did say that. Well, I think what I said is that I think my phrase was strictly speaking, it isn't ... I mean, strictly speaking, in the sense that if we say, it has to be after 1933, if ... and absolutely it goes to it reopens this question of, well, what then, this idea of, exile before exile. So I think what I also said is how Benjamin in his letters sees it coming. And absolutely in the themes, it's full of, as you say, just exiles, full stop, let alone the as you say, people on the move, people who have no interest in the things that the world otherwise, says is important. So, I mean, I would say yes, of course. Okay. I mean, to the extent that my sort of judgment of it matters. But I think what is interesting is that the roots of this are very, and the published roots as well, are before some of the things we associate with exile, the coming to power of the Nazis in January 1933, the fact that it becomes very hard to publish or harder to publish. Well, these had been published, yeah. And as you say, there's a kind of hustle in how is he now? What's he now going to do with this? Yeah. And indeed, the idea with not just the title, Deutsche for Deutsche Menschen, but the lettering and so on the cover is also meant to make it. And he goes under a pseudonym, Detlef Holz. You don't get much more German than Detlef Holz, and all that. Yeah. So I think it really, I mean, it softens in a way our idea of a kind of hard terminus ad quo for exile, and is one of the many reasons why it's such an interesting project. I think maybe
it just speaks to the realities of exilic production as well. Is that you might need to reuse some things now and then. You can't always sit there writing the next new novel. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I know we want to finish soon, but it's just a thought, and I don't really know how best to put it. But I'm thinking that to a certain point, we are at another point now where these anthologies play a really important role. I'm thinking of anthologies like Schildkröten, and das israelisch-palästinische Abendmahl. So what we're seeing, and in a sense, they are exilic voices as well.
Yeah.
So we have the Jewish and the Palestinians who have immigrated into Germany, who are now writing in German, and who are establishing via these Sammlungen, establishing community across a divide. So in that sense, it's different, isn't it? Because it's not the people who are in the same situation establishing their identity, but it's this coming together over a divide. But again, it's the choice of using the anthology to do this.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting.
Yes. Yes, indeed. I mean, it would be really interesting to know from editors and contributors of and to anthologies why, if you like, but one can certainly speculate. Part of it's practical, isn't it? That it's, if you publish, come together to publish an anthology, you only have to publish one book. Yeah, so if there's any reason why publishing is difficult, whether it's access to readership, whether it's the resources to publish, whether it's and so on, and then the anthology offers itself. But there's something about profile as well, isn't there? That an anthology gives profile to a group or a category, or defines a category, as I was vaguely trying to suggest, in a way that individual publications by those same authors don't necessarily. And one point that has been made about anthologies is that we often remember the anthology far better than we remember. Certainly than we can recall which texts are in it. Yeah? So I think Verboten und Verbrannt, 1947, very, very well known. I'm not going to bet because you may know, but I certainly couldn't give you anything like a complete list of the contents of it. Yeah, and yet there's this kind of iconic nature of the publication. There were anthologies, and again, I'm going to fail to remember the precise titles in this period, which did also publish, for example, Exiles alongside other writing, whether it was writing from the past. So again, we're back to these questions about historical continuities, whether it was with or among sort of internationally. So trying to form these connections that you're describing a slightly different way today, but again, very explicitly, there's a purpose to it. And Klaus Mann's Heart of Europe, if I remember rightly, is one, for example. But yeah. So
any last words?
There's a comment in the chat to Bischoff. The connection works in English between collection and recollection and recollection of memory. Is there a parallel association in German? Erinnerung really leads to very different connotations. And materiality, maybe, does this not go beyond the semiotic reading? Plurality of meaning, vulnerability of signs. So again, thank you for the encouragement to think along those lines.
In that case, drawing towards the end of this evening, and before we close, I'd like to mention the next seminar, which is on the 29th of January, and it's by one of our former PhD students here, so I'm delighted to be introducing her in January. And continuing the topic of writing in exile, her title is Writing in Exile, Kinder Transport Diaries and the Making of New Lives. It is up on the web, so please do register if you'd like to attend either in person, and we'd be very happy to see you in person. And if you can't make it, then on Zoom. So I wish you all a super season, whether it's Christmas or Hanukkah. And thank you so much, Steffan, for a most enjoyable and fascinating topic and for speaking about it in such an enjoyable way. And I found it very thought-provoking, and there are so many facets I'm sure we could discuss much longer. But thank you all very much for coming, and good night to those who watched and listened by Zoom. Many thanks.